In a scene from the play The Second Story Man by Upton Sinclair, a steelworker gets caught in a crane. His coworkers would have to take the entire crane apart to save him, so they cut his legs off instead. He was only a poor hunky, said one of his coworkers. There was nobody to know or care. Hunky was a racial slur in the early 1900s, one reserved for immigrants from Central or Eastern Europe, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, or Germans. In 1914, a factory worker recalled the people who were recently injured at his job, describing them as 5 men and 12 hunkies, implying that hunky immigrants were less than men. Godfrey Irwin's 1931 book, American Tramp and Underworld Slang, claims that hunky referred to someone little better than hunks or clods of dirt. The so-called hunkies arrived in America as part of the new immigrant wave after 1880. These were the people who came through Ellis Island: Italians, Poles, Russians, and other natives of Southern and Eastern Europe. They were largely Catholic or Jewish, unlike the old immigrants from Britain or Ireland who came before 1880. So what's with all the talk today of white culture? These people talk as if we could take for granted what white means.
Certain types of Anglo-derived culture that comes from our history.
Like what?
Let me think about this.
Someone from a Jewish family like Stephen Miller wouldn't have been accepted as white in 1890, but now he's on the front lines of enforcing America's white racial purity.
These are the criminal migrants that Kamala Harris brought into your community. And as swiftly as they came, Donald Trump will send them back.
Same goes for former Border Control head Gregory Bovino, who led his thugs into Minneapolis to harass and murder people. His family is Italian. What makes people like him and Miller so secure in their whiteness? Or maybe that's the point. Maybe they aren't secure.
You're a fucking loser, bitch! You're a bitch!
Maybe they're pick-me's who are anxious to prove how white they are. Part of the story of this series is about how the hunkies of yesterday became the white people of today. We'll work our way to that point in due time. But it's probably not a coincidence that people like Miller and Bovino are on the front line of today's culture wars, since their ancestors were also in the culture wars, just on the opposite side of it. The United States is a nation of immigrants. But it's also a nation that has always distrusted immigrants. The original inhabitants, the Native Americans, had every reason to distrust the Europeans who washed ashore in the 1600s. Then those Europeans became Americans, and they distrusted the people who arrived after them. In 1798, Congress passed a strict naturalization law aimed at French immigrants during the Quasi-War. Irish immigrants faced discrimination during the mid-1800s, giving rise to the Know-Nothing Party, who made anti-immigration their pet cause. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 flat-out barred immigration from China, while Theodore Roosevelt's Gentleman's Agreement in 1907 did the same thing for Japanese immigrants. Donald Trump was elected twice, the second time mostly due to his promise of mass deportations. Unless you think this is just a Republican thing, Democratic Presidents Obama and Biden loved them some deportations too. Kamala Harris campaigned in 2024 as a tough-on-immigration candidate, well after she told immigrants from the southern border,
"Do not come. Do not come."
There's something in America's fabric that makes us averse to immigration. Racism, perhaps? But weren't the hunkies of the early 1900s white? Weren't the Irish white? The answer simply is no. Or, more accurately, not yet. Most of the Irish who came during the mid-1800s were fleeing famine caused mostly by discriminatory British policy. When they arrived in the United States, the discrimination continued. They didn't speak English, they were poor, and, most unforgivable of all, they were Catholic. The United States is largely a Protestant nation. People like Anglicans, Presbyterian, Baptists, and Methodists. They didn't always get along, but they generally accepted each other as American. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church was led by the Pope, a guy who sits on a throne in Rome. Many Americans genuinely believe that the Irish took orders from him. Were they here to help the Pope take over?
They vote how the Archbishop tells them, and who tells the Archbishop
their king in the pointy hat what sits on his throne in Rome.
Northern states started requiring the Irish to send their children to public school, which the Irish resisted because public schools were very Protestant-coded. So they fought to build Catholic schools instead. You might say that the Irish feared being whitewashed, but it's more accurate to say they feared being wasp-washed. WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, were the true Americans at the time. Their ancestors were from Protestant areas of the British Isles, England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. Andrew Carnegie, the richest man in America at one point, might have been an immigrant, but he was Scottish, so he got a pass. Before his time, it was relatively easy for Americans to keep track of their racisms. Blacks, natives, Asians were all physically distinct from WASPs, so discriminating against them was easy. To discriminate against the Irish, people relied on accents, names, or neighborhoods. If you looked white, spoke good English, had an easy name, and attended a Protestant church, you were probably okay. Dastardly Andrew Carnegie changed everything. His factories pumped out enough steel to crisscross the country with railroads. People took the railroads west, where they claimed farmland thanks to the Homestead Act. Carnegie then sold these farmers steel tools to make the farming easier. Between 1860 and 1900, 3.75 million new farms came under cultivation, thanks in part to Carnegie Steel. Those farms grew enough food to feed factory workers in cities around the world. European farmers had to lower their prices to compete, causing many of them to go broke, sell their land, and move to cities to become factory workers themselves. They moved to London, Paris, Prague, Budapest, and Berlin, or they crossed the ocean to New York City, Boston, or Philadelphia. In 1892, Ellis Island was set up in New York Harbor to process the more than 14 million new immigrants who arrived during the first 2 decades of the 20th century. They spoke Italian, Polish, Czech, Russian, Yiddish, or Armenian, and practiced Catholicism or Judaism. They were called the new immigrants because they didn't fit into the neat racial categories Americans had established. They weren't British, Irish, Asian, or black, and they certainly weren't WASPs. They moved to New York City because that's where the factories were. The Lower East Side of Manhattan became one of the most densely populated pieces of land on Earth. The streets buzzed with the sounds of Yiddish, Polish, Italian, and countless other languages. Add to this mix a growing number of African Americans from the South. They came to cities for similar reasons as Europeans, to escape poverty and persecution, and to find jobs. The movement of African Americans from the southern countryside into cities is known as the Great Migration, and it coincided with the arrival of the new immigrants. To people living outside of cities, to the homestead farmers of the West who were largely native-born WASPs, the cities didn't look like America anymore. The people living there weren't truly American in their eyes. This gets at a fundamental truth of what it means to be white in America. Whiteness means not being black, or native, or Asian, or Hispanic. In the early 1900s, it also meant not being Irish or a new immigrant. How could the new immigrants be white? They didn't even speak English, or read the correct version of the Bible, or they read the Torah. They weren't American, and everyone knew that the default setting for an American was a WASP. As the factory worker from the beginning of the video said, you were either a man or you were a hunky. A white person in America is someone who isn't racialized. It's just a regular dude or lady, just an American. The new immigrants weren't regular dudes or ladies, so they were racialized, which means they weren't white. The whites of the countryside were alarmed at the stories coming out of the cities: poverty, drunkenness, and crime. They associated these things with immigrants and African Americans. It seemed that the America the whites knew was falling apart. Some progressive WASPs came to the cities to work in settlement houses or schools to teach new immigrants American ways. Some used journalism to draw attention to the effects of urban poverty. Some came to preach against the evils of alcohol. The progressives believed that immigrants could adapt with a little help. They could eventually become American. Other people just wanted to close the borders. Shut this entire immigration thing down before America gets pulled apart by a mishmash of people with different languages and religions. This nightmare seemed to be coming true when the census of 1920 showed that more people lived in cities than on farms for the first time ever. A culture war was brewing, one between country and city, native and immigrant, white and non-white. Congress declared war on Germany in April 1917, marking America's entry into World War I. Those immigrant workers would be needed to make weapons or sign up for the military. Could they even be trusted? Were they loyal to America, especially if they came from Germany? It turns out that nothing fuels a culture war better than a regular war. A week after entering the war, President Woodrow Wilson formed the Committee for Public Information, the CPI, a government agency to cheerlead the American people in supporting the war. In other words, it produced propaganda. It was headed by newspaperman George Creel, who said, if ads could sell face cream and soap, why not a war? The CPI, or Creel Commission as it was called, employed writers, journalists, actors, filmmakers, anyone with public influence to sell the war. The famous I Want You for the U.S. Army poster came out of the Creel Commission. They also published a pamphlet addressed to immigrants called Friendly Words to the Foreign-Born. Some of the friendly words are as follows. Let no foreign-born man comfort himself that, because he has not become a naturalized citizen, he owes no allegiance to the United States, and that he cannot be punished for treason to the United States. To clarify, the pamphlet cites the legal definition of treason. Whoever, owning allegiance to the United States, levies war against them, or adheres to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort within the United States or elsewhere, is guilty of treason. It then goes on to cite the punishment for treason as death, or not less than 5 years in prison and fined not less than $10,000. But what was treason? What did it mean to give aid and comfort to America's enemies? When should you drop dime on someone for doing so? Not knowing where the line was could get you imprisoned, or worse. So Congress passed a law in June of 1917 called the Espionage Act to clarify what treason meant. Anyone who shall willfully make or convey false reports or false statements with intent to interfere with the operation of the military or naval forces of the United States could be arrested for treason. Saying the wrong thing could get you in trouble. The Postal Service was empowered to refuse to deliver any publication it chose. In an era before television or internet, when most news spread via the written word, this effectively gave the post office power of censorship. Never before had the federal government restricted freedom of speech to this extent. Congressmen who supported the Espionage Act, like Albert Johnson of Washington State, were excited to use it against the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, a communist labor union nicknamed the Wobblies. The Wobblies' whole mission, in Johnson's words, was to breed hatred and contempt. This was perhaps news to the Wobbly leaders, who were avowed pacifists. What Johnson was really worried about was the Wobblies organizing immigrant workers. Johnson built his entire political career on hating immigrants, famously using every anti-immigrant slur on the floor of Congress. Italians were wops, Central Europeans were bohunks, and Chinese were coolies. Johnson was what we would call a nativist, someone who believed native-born Americans were better than immigrants. He was also a xenophobe, a term that refers to fear or hatred of immigrants. The two labels were usually interchangeable. He was the Stephen Miller of his day, and he targeted Stephen Miller's ancestors. Good old-fashioned American racists like the Espionage Act too, like Sidney Burleson of Texas, who President Wilson made the Postmaster General, the guy who oversees the National Postal Service. The Espionage Act gave him total control over which publications went through the mail and which didn't. He pretty much stopped every major communist newspaper from circulating. He also cracked down on those offensive Negro papers which constantly appeal to class and race prejudice. By this, he meant the nation's black newspapers like the Chicago Defender and W.E.B. Du Bois's The Crisis. The Espionage Act, a law designed to punish treason, was being used to punish anything that gave voice to the powerless. What kind of country associates uplifting the powerless with treason? The country Johnson and Burleson envisioned was a country where every white man farmed his own plot of land among a community of free white farmers, all of whom spoke the same language and believed in the same virtues. It smacked of Thomas Jefferson's idea of an empire of liberty. Jefferson thought a country like this could run smoothly enough not to need a strong central government. What they got instead was Alexander Hamilton's America, a commercial and industrial powerhouse of cities with 100 different languages, religions, and races. It was impossible to build Jefferson's Empire of Liberty under these conditions, but maybe they could use the newfound power of the government to make it possible. Nothing stood in their way more than communism, which treated the waspy white country farmer the same as the urban immigrant worker. To the wasps of the small towns, communism was an immigrant idea that they used to think that they were equal. In 1912, the Socialist Party candidate, Eugene Debs, the most visible symbol of American-style communism, won 6% of the popular vote, a tremendous showing for a third-party candidate. He not only won votes from factory workers in the cities, but from farmers and miners out west too. Even more alarming, Debs wasn't a foreigner with a thick accent. He was born in Indiana, used the language of Protestant Christianity in his speeches, and had the reputation of being compassionate, humane, and thoroughly peaceful. To the Johnsons and Burlesons of America, this made him especially dangerous. He was living proof that communism wasn't just for new immigrants. Even waspy small-town Americans could get on board. The Espionage Act gave them the power to finally silence him. In a now famous speech in Canton, Ohio, Debs said, "They have always taught you that it is your patriotic duty to go to war and to have yourselves slaughtered at their command. But in all the history of the world, the people never had a voice in declaring war." These words landed Debs in a jail for violating the Espionage Act. History books claim he encouraged people not to sign up for the draft, but nowhere in his Canton speech did he say such a thing. Despite this, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He appealed the verdict all the way up to the Supreme Court. In the case of Debs versus the United States, Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes upheld Debs's conviction. This came after Holmes had ruled in another case, Schenck v. the United States, that freedom of speech is not absolute. The government, he said, can suppress speech that presents a clear and present danger to the country. Debs encouraging his largely immigrant audience to oppose the war fit that description. Holmes believed this type of speech is dangerous. He compared it to shouting fire in a crowded theater. It can cause harm, so it's not protected under the First Amendment. Holmes's decision still stands as one of the main limitations on free speech in America. In the audience during Debs's Canton speech were members of the American Protective League, the APL. They were the ones who snitched on him to the government and got him arrested. But they didn't work for the government or get paid to snitch. They were vigilantes who did it for the love of the game. In many cases, they did more than just snitched. They spied on, harassed, assaulted, and even murdered people who they thought opposed the war. The APL was a perfect outlet for men who wanted some excitement without having to suit up for the army. Many of them were respectable wasps from small-town America. Most of their victims were Union men and immigrants. Like Johnson and Burleson, they used the war as an excuse to put immigrants in their place. And the APL had powerful friends. The federal government certainly knew they existed and often worked with them to round up suspects. Business owners knew they existed too, and offered them material support to break labor unions. You can think of the APL as the 1920s version of the Proud Boys, an organization of thugs who operate with impunity thanks to the cooperation of government and business.
Proud Boys, stand back and stand by.
Proud Boys played a prominent role in MAGA's January 6th insurrection, and many of them have since been hired by Trump's Department of Homeland Security as ICE agents. And the APL often battled with the Wobblies. The Wobblies weren't the largest labor union, but they accepted immigrants on an equal basis to everyone else. This was enough to make them targets for the APL. Many of them were arrested for opposing the war, including the leader, Big Bill Haywood. He, along with 100 Wobblies, were put on trial in the largest civilian case in American history. They weren't accused of doing anything. Like Debs, they were on trial for things they said. When prosecutors started questioning them, it was clear that wasn't all they were on trial for. Each of the defendants were asked specifically about their racial stock, in other words, their ethnicity. Those of German descent were singled out for harsh questioning. Lawyers wanted to show the jurors that Germans couldn't possibly be loyal Americans. Jewish Wobblies got the same treatment, since stereotypes associated Jews with communism. After a blatantly unfair trial, all but 2 of the Wobblies were sentenced to at least a year in prison. The leader, Big Bill Haywood, caught 20 years. The judge on the case was chosen precisely because the government knew he would hand down harsh sentences. His name was Kennesaw Mountain Landis of Georgia, a small-town waspy American who had no use for immigrants. He gained so much fame from the trial that he went on to become the commissioner of Major League Baseball, which had gotten a shady reputation due to rampant gambling, some of it by Italian and Jewish organized crime families. Baseball owners hoped he would clean up baseball's reputation, which he did by banning for life all of the players involved in fixing the 1919 World Series, the so-called Black Sox scandal. He remained commissioner for the next 35 years, where he kept both gambling away and barred African Americans. America would have to wait until after Landis wasn't commissioner anymore to see Jackie Robinson. And anyone who's watched sports lately might have noticed that gambling has made a big return. I guess it's acceptable when immigrants aren't making the profits. The United States didn't spend much time in the war, with the fighting all but over by 1919. Yet, the country changed forever. The need to make weapons, draft soldiers, and build public support made the federal government more powerful than it had ever been before. Much of that power was used to break labor unions or force immigrants to prove their loyalty. Socialist and communist leaders like Eugene Debs and Bill Haywood were thrown in jail. Their quest to organize for the rights of immigrant workers were stopped in its tracks, never really to recover. The progressive movement that sought to help immigrants also got stopped in its tracks. Some historians see World War I as the moment the United States slammed the door shut once and for all on the possibility of having a just society. The forces of capitalism, nativism, and racism overtook the country, giving rise to the decade known as the Roaring '20s.